In this video, we're going to be going over Chapter 11, looking at individual differences and the behavior that goes along with that. Personality is basically the stable traits that we have. Many times people will think, or some of the research is looking at saying, basically your personality was formed by the time you're 5 years old. The jury is still kind of out on that. A lot of changes can happen based on growth, based on experiences and things like this. One of the instruments that's used many times in looking at personality is what's called the Big Five. And you can see that there are 5 key things that are measured in that Big Five. You have extroversion, in other words, how outgoing, how talkative are you? In other words, where do you get your energy from? Agreeableness, how trusting and good-natured are you? Conscientiousness, in other words, dependability, achievement oriented. Emotional stability, in other words, how relaxed and secure are you in yourself? And then openness to experience, how imaginative, how curious are you? Some of the research looking at this saying that being high in some of these things are very indicative of good managers in organizations. There are various Big Five personality dimensions that are, or it's instruments that are out there. You may want to check it out and see what it is that you can find on that. There's also that idea of core self-evaluation. How do we see ourselves? There's self-efficacy. In other words, our belief in ourselves. Can we do a particular task that goes along with that? One of the things that managers need to do is try to avoid that whole idea of learned helplessness. In other words, if you believe that somebody can't do something, and we'll get into the Pygmalion effect in a little bit, if you believe that they cannot do something and you're having to constantly tell them or constantly do things for them, you start getting more of that learned helplessness. You need to avoid that as a manager wherever possible to try to build up one's self-efficacy. You have self-esteem. In other words, how much do they like or dislike themselves? People with high self-esteem handle failure better, all right? And some of the things that managers can do is reinforce some of those positive attributes and give positive feedback wherever possible. Find things that people are doing right. You have locus of control. In other words, where do you put blame as far as things that happen to you? Is it internal? In other words, you believe you control your destiny, or is it external? You think it's external forces that are doing it to you. In other words, you're a victim. One of the things that I've done in Canvas in this module is put an instrument out there looking at the locus of control. I highly suggest you go through there, score it, and see where your locus is. Are you more internal or are you more external? You have emotional stability. In other words, feeling secure and unworried about what's actually going to be happening, not experiencing the anxiety. And then you have emotional intelligence. In other words, being able to monitor your own and others' feelings that go along with this. Emotional intelligence basically has several different traits. There's the internal and the external. The internal is more self-awareness. In other words, being able to read your own emotions and moods. Self-management is being able to control those emotions and your actions. The external is social awareness, empathy. What do you see going on with others? And then relationship management. In other words, how are you working with others? I've put a link to an instrument where you can kind of measure your emotional intelligence. It's in the module on Canvas. I highly suggest you check it out. Then you have the idea of values and attitudes. Values are the things that we hold dear, the things that are very important to us. Attitudes are basically how we kind of feel and think about things. You'll see this little thing that I have here. V leads to A, leads to B. Our values lead to our attitudes about things, which then leads to our behaviors. So the things that we hold very dear and very close to us will determine what some of our attitudes about those things and others are, which then leads to how we behave and how we act on those things. When you start thinking about those attitudes, there's basically the feeling, believing, and behavioral aspect of it. The affective is how you feel or the emotions that you have about a particular situation or thing or person. What you believe are your beliefs and knowledge, and then your behavior is what you intend or expect to do based on a particular situation. If you have a mismatch between how you feel about things and how you behave about things, is when you start getting cognitive dissonance. In other words, you might believe that it's illegal, it's wrong to steal, but you find that you start taking things from other people. And all of a sudden, you start getting this cognitive dissonance as far as, well, what is it that I'm actually doing here? And it really causes some stress and some issues in trying to balance those things. Then we start thinking about perceptions. Our perceptions are truth for us. The way a person perceives something is truth for that person. And that quote that I have here, we perceive the world as we are, not as it is. It's one of the things that Stephen Covey talked about in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, really looking at those ideas of how do we perceive what it is that's going on. Our perceptions can be distorted, all right? There's this idea of stereotyping. In other words, you see somebody who's part of a particular, who you assume is part of a particular group, and you have a tendency to attribute attributes of that entire group to the individual. So, for example, there could be sex role stereotypes or age or race or something along those lines. In other words, you see a particular person who may be a part of a group, and you attribute all of the things that go with that group to that person. It's not necessarily true. Everybody is different. You also have implicit bias. In other words, it's kind of that unknown bias that we have. Yeah, I don't think I'm biased, but, I see some of these things. You have what's called the halo effect. In other words, you have a first impression about something or just a single trait about a particular person, and you assume a bunch of stuff based on that one piece of information. You have what's called the recency effect. In other words, somebody may have done a great job over the entire year, and they make one mistake right before the performance review is done. And the boss downgrades the person's performance because of that one mistake that just recently had. In other words, they have a tendency to forget the stuff that came earlier and focus in on just what happened recently. You have causal attributions. In other words, things like the fundamental attribution bias. We have a tendency to attribute somebody's behavior based on a particular bias. For example, let's say that we have a good relationship with another person. That person does something that impacts us. Because of that good relationship that we have, we will assume that that person did it to us because they were forced to by their boss, or it was something outside of themselves that forced them to do that. If we have a poor relationship with that person, then we will assume that the reason why that person did something to us was because they didn't like us. In other words, it was more internal. Then you have what's called the self-serving bias. In other words, something good happens, we have a tendency to take positive credit for it. Something bad happens, it's somebody else's fault. They did it to us. Then you have what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy, or the Pygmalion effect. It is so powerful, it's unreal. If you, as a manager, believe that somebody that's working for you can succeed and they're great employees and stuff, they have a tendency to become great employees. If you, as a manager, feel a particular person can't do something, they're a poor employee, they're going to become a poor employee. How we feel about them unconsciously impacts our behaviors with them. I've put out a great video, about a 5-minute video in Canvas in the module that looks at the Pygmalion effect. It gives you the background and also how powerful that really is. One of the things that you can do as a manager is make sure that you are providing positive performance expectations. You firmly believe, truly believe, that the person can succeed. And what you do is you give the feedback that goes along with it. Because of some of the things that are happening, we're going to be engaged or not. Employee engagement is our involvement and satisfaction within the organization. How engaged, how focused are we on making sure that we are going to be effective and the organization is going to be effective? Job satisfaction comes from some of that engagement. In other words, how we feel about our jobs. Are we happy with it? Do we feel gratified with what it is that we're doing? You can see that somebody who has good job satisfaction has stronger motivation and involvement. There's less turnover. There's less stress when people are more satisfied with their jobs. With that also comes organizational commitment. How committed are we to the company? How committed are we to helping the company succeed? How proud are we? How do we talk it up when we're with our friends? Diversity is something that impacts a lot of this. In other words, how are we alike and unlike as far as all the people within the organization? Many times when people think about diversity, they think about the illegal areas of discrimination. The illegal areas of discrimination: race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, veteran status, disability. We have a tendency to think of those illegal areas of discrimination. Those are more of the internal dimensions. Diversity is much more than that. You also have these external dimensions. In other words, when you start talking about diversity, there's also geographic locations. Where do people choose to live? What kind of personal habits do they choose? What kind of religion do they choose? Their educational background, their appearance. All of these things also come into play when you start talking about diversity. So when you start thinking diversity, it's not just those illegal areas of discrimination: race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, veteran status, disability. It's also the external stuff. In other words, where do different people come from? What Some people like a neat desk. Some of us like a messy desk. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into diversity than just the illegal areas of discrimination. We do have a lot of trends in our workforce diversity that's coming in. The baby boomers are aging out. They're retiring more and more, and the millennials are going to become much bigger. In other words, Gen Y. Gen X is a little bit smaller. Okay, Gen Y is becoming much bigger and becoming the largest adult generation. There's more and more women and people of color in the workforce. Sexual orientation is very different. Their workplaces are much more inclusive about this. And also, people are starting to figure out that just because somebody may have a particular physical or mental lack of ability in certain areas doesn't mean that they can't be good employees. There are a lot of barriers to having good diversity in the organization. You have your stereotypes and prejudices. You have a fear of discriminating against the majority. In other words, you don't want to upset the apple cart in certain areas. Maybe you have a negative climate when it comes to diversity. There's a lot of barriers that get in the way of having a good, diverse workforce in the organization. And because of all of these things, we may experience stress. Stress is that tension that we feel, and it could be both physical and mental when we have a lot of stuff that we have to handle and we're starting to question our ability to handle all of the things that we're supposed to. There's a lot of different causes of stress. In other words, there's some people who put a lot more stress on themselves, the type A personality. Maybe the job that you have is very stressful. For example, my daughter is a cop, and those times it can be very, very stressful. That goes in as far as the job is concerned. Maybe you have the role demands are very important and very stressful that go along with that. Maybe there's conflict within the family. All right. So there's a lot of sources as far as the job related stress that people experience. What managers can do is help people build their resilience, making sure they understand what it is that they can and cannot do. Help with employee assistance programs. In other words, with employee assistance programs, people can go get some of the counseling that may be necessary to help them deal with the stress. Look at holistic approaches. Do everything you can to try to make the jobs as interesting as possible. In other words, people can see what is the impact that their job has on the overall organization. So these are some things that we can do to help manage and reduce some of the stress that people may be experiencing. These are some of the key points from the chapter. I strongly suggest you go back and look at the video on the Pygmalion effect and also do the 2 instruments that are out there in the module. Give me a shout if you have questions.